Hi, Matthew.
Hi, how you doing, Bob?
I'm doing okay. I should tell people you're Matthew Lee of Intercity Press and our tireless United Nations correspondent. You cover the UN as no one else does. I think it's safe to say.
That's for better or worse. Yeah.
And not everyone at the UN is happy about the way you cover the UN, Matthew. But
it's a great place actually to be. I mean, since we're on Blogging Heads, I'll say it's a great place to do blog style reporting from, because there's just so much, I mean, some people would say the information is not all, is in every little bit of it's not important, but there's a lot of it, and you can, you get everything between the Russian ambassador, telling you that he's complained against the Secretary General's statement, to, the Secretary General's little rostrum being rolled out and what that means, and ambassadors going to circuses. So it's a good mishmash.
And you are a veritable data sponge. All of these little intricacies we can count on you revealing for us. And now I guess one of the big topics there is Libya, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's been obviously ever since I guess it really began it's a week ago today. There was the council based on a letter from one of these Libyan diplomats that renounced Gaddafi, asked for a meeting about his own country, which is very rare. So they held a meeting on that, and then they ended up, Saturday was the big day here, where they at the end of the day at 8 p.m. they passed a resolution imposing sanctions on Gaddafi and some of his relatives, and referring the case of Libya, with at least one exception, to the International Criminal Court.
Yes, and the one exception, I gather, amounts to a loophole for mercenaries, according to your reporting. Is that right?
That's true. It's that the U.S. is always, the U.S. as I'm sure the blogging heads, wise guys know, never joined the ICC.
This is the International Criminal Court that we had the option to join. Well, I guess it was originally under Clinton, right?
Yeah, exactly. Actually, under Clinton, there was some thought that the U.S. would join, and they participated in negotiations to set up, regulations of the court. Ultimately, it seems like the Defense Department, and this holds true under Democrats as well, the Defense Department became concerned that U.S. soldiers, particularly, in their case, in their argument, doing the Lord's work of UN peacekeeping, although the U.S. actually rarely joins these missions, would somehow be sent to the court and become sort of a political football. So the U.S. tries to. Initially, they tried to strong-arm countries into signing immunity agreements with them. Now they try to insert into any resolution involving the ICC this exception.
And we are not a party to the ICC, right?
No, exactly, we're not.
Okay, and so anyway, all of this leads to you argue a kind of a loophole for mercenaries in this latest Libya resolution. Explain how that happened.
Yeah, that's the kind of because the U.S. doesn't want to come right out and have a resolution. Basically, this resolution says we refer the case of Libya, because Libya is not an ICC member either, so it required the Security Council to refer it. We refer the case of Libya to the ICC, except for the nationals of states which are not a member of the ICC. That's really a reference to the U.S., but it also, it would apply to people from Algeria, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, and there's a lot of allegations of mercenary use.
Right. So these would be people that allegedly are brought in by Gaddafi to kill his own people, and they would be exempt under this deal because we apparently insisted that the Security Council build in this exemption so that it would not apply to Americans, right?
Interesting, exactly. There's some, they've come back, because I've been, since Saturday, I've been beating that drum, and there's some idea that somehow we would exempt only people somehow related to the resolution. Of course, that can be read, if you're actually targeted by the resolution, you're also related to it. So it was a really kind of a sloppy job. I think that Brazil was one country on the council, and they actually had the presidency, for the month of February. They spoke out against it and said, we think this is a bad thing for international law to have this carve out, but they went along and voted for it. But here was the kind of interesting thing that might be of interest. The French ambassador said, well, the Americans demanded this because they have, quote, parliamentary considerations. So this morning I asked him what he meant, and he said, well, Obama has to prove to Congress that he's defending, these American soldiers. But, it was a straight executive Obama administration decision. There was no kind of back and forth that I'm aware of with Congress of sort of to show the bona fides of fighting the ICC.
Right. No, they probably just anticipated the blowback. So are you the one who kind of broke the mercenary loophole angle?
I didn't. The weird thing about it is that we were all day Saturday, basically, because, they usually don't meet here Saturday, but because of the Libya thing, there was a lot of press coverage. There was an all-day meeting. There was most of the focus of the journalistic coverage was about, the countries that might not want to refer the case to the ICC. Everyone assumed that Russia and China wouldn't. Ultimately, they did do it. France, I guess I'll say that, a Western diplomat came out and tried to say Portugal was being a backslider. that turned out not to be true. So basically, there were so many kind of ruses and so much smoke and mirrors that this only really came out when, after the resolution passed, there were stakeouts, and you can ask questions of the ambassadors. And I fired away and asked the French ambassador, I sort of made it a pointed question. He said, "You're absolutely right, but this country, America, insisted on it." And there was I don't want to beat my own drum, but there was a kind of a collective gasp of breath, because so often, I mean, among at least the sort of Western reporters at the UN, everyone just sort of, it's just an old saw that Russia and China will try to block everything. And here they didn't,
Huh. And so have you gotten blowback on your interpretation of this?
I've gotten a little bit. I got an email from I'm trying to think how to put it. Everything you get at the UN is on background. So people will send you their arguments, but then, like I got an email from, let's say, a European country that's a big fan of the ICC, pointing to maybe this would only exempt people that are being sent as part of the UN, under the UN resolution. That's not really how it's written. And then today I pressed the Liechtenstein ambassador. I can say that there was a press conference here about the International Criminal Court, and he admitted that this is a bad thing for international law to have. Every time you have these kind of carve-outs, everyone's talking about no impunity. Let's even say it only applied to people sent by the UN. You're basically saying international justice is good for everyone except people. If we send them in to do the right thing, even if they end up doing the wrong thing, they can't be prosecuted. It would be like, let's say, the UN in Rwanda saying a priori that even if they stand by as people are slaughtered, they can't be prosecuted. And I think it's a bad thing for international law, especially when you explicitly fight for it in a resolution where you're claiming you're solving a problem.
Okay. So now, where do we stand on Libya? Are there other things that may come through the Security Council on Libya?
There is this idea. First, I mean, the most. I don't know if it's pressing. We're recording this on Tuesday afternoon, and I don't think it'll have much effect, but it should be good theatrics. Libya is being thrown off the Human Rights Council, which is this UN body based in Geneva, 47 members that talks about human rights. Libya has been a member, which was even before this recent crackdown was a source of some amusement or anger at the UN. Now they're being thrown off. The irony is that they're being thrown off at a time where the Libyan diplomats in Geneva and New York are all anti-Gaddafi. They've all come out against him. But there's a vote this afternoon in the General Assembly to throw them off, and I was told last night it's going to be done not unanimously, but with a sort of a speech after the non-vote by Venezuela and Egypt.
So you say it's ironic because the people who would be serving on the Human Rights Council are now kind of the good guys.
Exactly. And that's actually been the most dramatic part of this story has been these. Like a week ago today, the deputy ambassador of Libya in the U.S. said Gaddafi is terrible, he has to be stopped. But the main ambassador said Gaddafi is my friend. He was basically crying. Some, including me, said that he smelled like liquor. He came to the council and very kind of torn up and said, I've told him if he doesn't stop the violence, I'll quit. But he's been my friend for life. He came to the council over the weekend and said, please refer to the ICC. He likened Gaddafi to Pol Pot and Hitler. So it's been a huge.
This is the sober version of him.
This is the sober version. I don't know if I mean actually that's the thing is I reported it because I was sitting right next to him and smelled it, but I don't think it's that the guy is necessarily. I mean he actually had a drinking incident
Matthew,
before.
Aren't you breaking some unwritten code of journalism when you report that the guy talking smelled like alcohol to you?
I feel that.
I don't think that's the way they did it in the JFK days, man.
No, exactly, and I don't like to play into the kind of sensationalist. Blogging cliche, but I mean, when you're standing, 4 inches from somebody at the center of a political storm, and you literally have to hold your nose and not light a match to not be catching fire.
I always do that. Like if I'm talking to somebody who smells like alcohol, I just bring it up. I say, "Man, you smell like alcohol."
You know what? I wish somebody had done that, but he literally, the guy was crying. Anyway, I think nobody really disagreed with it. And it's the bigger difficulties you get in here are sort of like. There are these kind of unwritten rules that the main ambassadors of countries, if they talk to you, unless they say off the record, it's supposed to be on the record, So so you report these things. Sometimes these, they'll regret later what they said. But the funny thing is that they're always trying to spin you. I mean, it's like if you know someone's a reporter, I would say, in today's day and age, and especially, if you have some special meeting with them over coffee, you're going to say at the beginning, this is off the record. But if you're just coming out of the Security Council and I'm there and say, hey, what do you think of the no-fly zone? I got to figure that your answer is
on the record. Oh, we got a big announcement there?
No, I'm sorry, but they'll just take. Believe it or not, this is the UN's speaker system. I'm sorry for our viewers.
Circa 1962. What are
they have speakers
you?
in our ceiling, Bob. This is we're under surveillance here.
Anything important that they're saying?
That's actually about Darfur. He's reading it a second time, and then we're.
Okay, if there's any news, I want you to share.
Yeah, breaking news from
Anyway, to summarize what we just said, the way a person's breath smells is on the record.
Yeah, I think it's hard to. Yeah, unless you explicitly say my smell is off the record, I think you're on.
You have to say, yeah. And you have to say it before you exhale.
Exactly.
Because once they've written it down, sorry, a little late.
No, there was no gotcha on that. I mean, I think it was really and my idea was, I even spoke to people that know the guy pretty well, is that in the week between his statement that, Gaddafi is my friend, and his later saying that he's like Pol Pot, there was a lot of soul searching. I mean, the difficulty for both of these guys, even the guy who came, both of them have represented Libya for years, right?
Yeah.
So the question is, okay, what Gaddafi is doing now is obviously terrible, but it's not like what he was doing last year or the year before, or in '96 when he killed 1,000 prisoners in 3 minutes or an hour or something. None of this was very good, and these guys didn't quit then. So I think they have some. It's difficult, Can
I float a theory by you
Please.
here? That once it became apparent that he was probably going down, they decided to get off the boat.
Oh, I think it's that. I think it's just as simple as that, and I think that that's why that probably even explains the difference between the Tuesday and the Saturday position of this Ambassador Shalgam, is that the odds just kept changing.
Yeah, and you got to pay attention to the odds. So one thing that is that a lot of people are talking about outside of the United Nations.
Okay. Is there a world outside of the UN, Bob?
There is a world, but it's related to the world inside.
Sure.
This no-fly zone business is the latest thing people are floating. And I read in some places that actually logistically this is a much more daunting thing than people may realize. So I'm not sure it's going to happen. And if you really want to keep him from misusing his Air Force, some people say, just bomb the damn jets on the runway. Just take his Air Force out.
Right.
But in any event, I'm not hearing that much about any kind of military intervention ranging from no-fly zone forward going through the United Nations for authorization, although it would be my personal preference that if you could get it authorized there, you'd do so. I gather one reason that's not being discussed is because people think it just wouldn't get through the Security Council because presumably Russia would veto it, or what?
Yeah, no, that's a very, I guess here's what I can say is that, just in terms of like what was said publicly, after the vote on Saturday, the French ambassador was asked, why isn't a no-fly zone in? And he said, we found that it was difficult to do that in the Bosnia case. He said that. Last night, one of the, not the world's most powerful ambassador, but Colombia's on the Security Council. The Colombians said, we obviously would oppose any kind of military action, and said that even the U.S. during the meetings on Saturday went out of its way to say that it had no intention, at least at that time, of taking military action. There is this weird, not weird, I think the Secretary General of NATO, Rasmussen, has said it can only be done legally, according to him, with Security Council endorsement,
I think as a technical matter, that's right. I mean, if you take international law really, really seriously, the only legal form of aggression is, either authorized by the United Nations or in straightforward self-defense, right?
Or, here, the one thing is, I think there's because there's a lot of, one example I thought of was France at one point dropped a bomb in Chad. They claimed not on, but next to some rebels that were going to try to overthrow Idris Deby, the longtime leader, sort of the Chad's own Muammar Gaddafi. And their claim was that if you're invited by a country to do it, you can. You see what I mean? It's only involuntary.
The question becomes who is the legal representative
exactly. And they could probably blur it here and say that these sometimes boozed up, I'm sorry to say, Libyan ambassadors invited it.
Yeah, but the good news is that it's when he's sober that he's more in the mood to bomb Libya, right?
No, when he's sober, he says bomb the planes on the ground. When he said, because
has he actually said that?
No, he didn't. They definitely didn't say that. And I think,
he might.
Yeah, they'd have a tough time. I think I've seen exactly. I think things maybe it all depends on sort of how long this plays out and stays as a big deal. But the UK is already talking about trying to send do something militarily. It's not clear. I don't mean to, this is. I'll admit that I barely left the UN building in the last week, so I really don't know what's happening. But it's not. I wonder how you'll react to this. There's this idea that by bombing your own civilians from the air, you've put yourself totally, outside of you're irredeemable. At least, my understanding is like, for example, in Sri Lanka, the government totally bombed rebels and civilians from the air. That Israel does it, doesn't, maybe it's not its own civilians, but conducts airstrikes over Gaza pretty frequently, Which doesn't. I'm not excusing.
Yeah, I mean, they would always say that they're aiming at at armed militants,
right.
and that and that any other deaths are accidental. But yes, I mean, if your point is that we pick and choose when we decide to enforce what we see as international norms, there is no doubt about that.
Yeah, and I don't mean to be naive in saying that. I just sort of sometimes and I think that actually, again, maybe I'm just needlessly controversial in this, but I think there was this weird, because even the Libyans turned back for a moment from talking about air attacks, and there was some idea that this. I mean, for example, if a military unit of Libya breaks away from the government and says we're going with the people, but still has guns shooting at the sky, are they a legitimate target? I mean, I don't know, but I think that there's a difference between shooting at them and shooting at civilians, obviously, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it looks like in any event, we are not feeling too constrained by international law, because it sounds like if we do the no-fly zone, we're not even going to try to get it through the Security Council, right?
Right.
And I would personally hope that we would make it seem as unlike a unilateral American intervention as possible. NATO, whatever, but and it's kind of a shame that I don't know, why would Russia be just irreversibly against this kind of thing?
I guess, I mean, number one, I don't think they haven't yet at least been sort of public, they haven't been, what do you call it, isolated or exposed as the only opponent for it. I mean, I'm telling you that Colombia, which is a major U.S. ally, their ambassador last night told me they would oppose any type of military action.
And why do they oppose?
I think
we should say that their opposition matters a lot less because they don't
have the veto. That's why I was saying it's not the world's most.
Anyway, why does Colombia oppose it?
I think that it's a kind of a Latin feeling against interfering in the internal matters of others. I mean, I guess if you presented it to them as a matter of responsibility to protect or stopping genocide, they might not be against it. But the idea of sort of, a blank check to the U.S. to go and bomb and invade, they at least he claims he was really against it. Here's another of the sort of micro UN things. Is the Colombia's ambassador to the UN, until he took this job 2 months ago, was in fact the head of the World Coffee Organization, and was last night telling us how that's why he understands Africa so well, because he's visited all these countries in the course of his coffee. Being head of he met Laurent Gbagbo of Cote d'Ivoire. He's met all these guys, so it's kind of so far we're calling him Mr. Coffee. But I think Russia does really have a principled position. Maybe it's unprincipled because of Chechnya, but they really are against saying, they'll say this is an internal affair. We don't think the UN should get involved in it. They said this about Ivory Coast, where they don't really have a big economic interest, but they didn't like the idea of the UN trying to determine who is the winner of an election, and they literally stalled some pretty straightforward council action for weeks based on their thing. So they're one of the, you may not, you or I may not like their principles, but they're actually not unprincipled. They sort of stick to their guns on that.
They are consistent on being against Security Council intervention, except in the most clear-cut cases.
I think, and then China, on the other hand, I almost view it. This is kind of a cynic's view from maybe being here. I don't want to say too long. I'm still learning, but there's the idea that like a country like China, they don't like the UN getting involved. I mean, for them, it's like a toss-up. The moment you start letting the UN kind of pontificate and say, "Don't crack down," who's going to stop them from dealing Tiananmen Square? Who's going to stop them if they choose to retake Taiwan? So, and I think in the case of China, China's it's a rising power. It's sort of like they're basically on the Security Council in order to limit its power. They're basically there. I don't want to say as a stumbling block or as a kind of a spoiler, but they're basically there to monitor their interest, and it's in their interest to have a world with fewer rules. More stability, and stability usually means the ability of a government to crack down on opponents.
But I mean, is it that simple that they want few rules and we want more? I mean, sometimes we
I agree. I don't think we
play stumbling block, and most recently in the case of the settlements resolution.
There you go.
When pretty much the entire world wanted to deem the Israeli settlements illegal, and we vetoed it.
I think and we'll get to that. I actually was going to say that as well. I think that U.S. and China, as the two actually, obviously most powerful countries, they don't really want the UN to go beyond its mandate. I mean, Obama might say he wants it to, but there are many problems at which he hasn't even tried to get it involved. So I think it's true. Countries that have like real power in the real world want to constrain the power of the UN, and countries
I'm not sure that in either of these cases it would have been the UN going beyond its mandate. I mean, arguably, first of all, the Security Council, I think, is authorized to declare things illegal that are inconsistent with with international law, right?
It's not. I'll be kind of a stickler. I don't think the Security Council is a court because it's so political. Their mandate really is things that are, it's quote, threats to international peace and stability.
And security.
So anything that's a cross-border fight, they have jurisdiction over. But it's often argued that if something is purely internal, that they can't take it up. And that's why, for example, it's very controversial when they try to deal with Myanmar. China, Russia, and others blocked that. Right. When they tried to get involved in Zimbabwe, even with the violence caused by Mugabe, it was argued that this is an internal. The moment it's two states shooting at each other,
yeah.
You know what I mean?
Although, correct me if I'm wrong, but the part of the UN Charter that authorizes the Security Council to do pretty much anything when it deems there to exist a threat to international peace and security, that is not explicitly confined to issues of trans-border conflict, right?
No, you're right. You can always make the argument that even what might seem to some internal is a threat. So that's what the Western countries do about Myanmar.
And I think in Libya, it's not that hard to make the threat. And you know what the argument I'd make about Libya is that when you've got God knows how much more ferment in the Arab world coming, it's actually kind of regionally dangerous not to send the message to people like Gaddafi that, look, there's two ways. Once the people tell you to go, there's two ways you can go. Yep. Peacefully, without killing a bunch of civilians, and in a box, okay? I mean, or else, in a court of law or something. But in other words, there's no way you do what Gaddafi is doing and get away with it. I think you could argue that for the good of the entire region right now, you need to send
I think that even the Russias and Chinas agreed with that. I think that's that. I mean, actually, they weren't the problem, and they did go along with that. Here's the one thing. Maybe it's again looking for controversy, but it seemed to me, and at least in the last couple of weeks, that the elephant in the room is that the UK and to some degree the US, they spent a lot of time and money rebuilding their relationship with Gaddafi. Gaddafi was the total, before this crackdown, he was, the New York Post calls him crazy, they calls him a cross-dresser, but the moment that he paid some billions of dollars for the Lockerbie blowing up of the plane and, disassembled a somewhat illusory nuclear program, they all cut deals with it. In the UK, Tony Blair, there's all these pictures of him with Gaddafi. So I think, it's now only of kind of historical interest because the Obama administration has gotten on board and is, beating the drum. But I think that they were actually surprisingly slow to talk about this crackdown, at least initially. And I think that it was explained to me that part of the UK was the sponsor of this resolution that passed Saturday, that part of the reason that it was passed is that the current conservative government wants to shame the Labour government, which cut the deals with Libya and released the Lockerbie bomber, right? And that this is all kind of, again, this is all sort of, it's not the end result is they did pass sanctions, etc., but that there is a kind of a subtext here of obviously they're also a big oil producer,
Yeah, although at the moment most of the wells seem to be in the hands of the rebels, right?
Yeah, exactly. No, absolutely, that's true. But I'm just saying, in terms of international interest in what happens in the country, there's no, and I think you're right. I even think, I was talking. I know the Chinese delegation here pretty well. I should take back what I said. They don't want the UN to do anything. They like stability. You know what I mean? A world that's stable works for them because they're becoming ever more powerful economically in Africa, even in Latin America. So they definitely don't like things that shake things up.
Right.
So in this case, in fact, the weirdest thing is they voted for this ICC referral. Not only are they not a member of the ICC, they're on record as not liking it. Obviously, they'd probably be afraid to be referred to it in someday.
The other weird thing about the ICC referral is, I'm not against it, but it does seem to have some tactical disadvantages. Anything that says to Gaddafi, look, at this point, you've gone over the edge, and when we get a hold of you, we're putting you in jail forever. Anything that sounds like that only reduces his incentive to finally surrender.
I think you're absolutely, and actually some brought that up. I was talking to the Indian ambassador. He said exactly that. He said that until the last moment of the vote on Saturday, he was arguing that they should keep this bullet in the chamber. That they should say, if you don't stop in the next week, we'll refer you or something.
I think that's not a crazy view.
Yeah, I don't think so either,
In a way, this is kind of the feel-good, easy way out, the ICC resolution, because you don't have to actually commit anything material. You don't have to put anybody in harm's way. you just say we're on the side of right, but in fact what you've done is alter his incentive structure in a possibly unfortunate way.
What they tried to say is one of the Western spokespeople tried to say to us that they decided that there's nothing was going to really change Gaddafi's mind, but that this referral might convince some of those near and close to him, which are basically his own family, to somehow step off. The thing is, there's no guarantee under this resolution, even if one of his sons were to denounce the resolution, denounce the regime today. It's basically they've referred the case of Libya from February 15th onwards. So anything that can be proved since February 15th, there's no getting out of it. And so I kind of agree, actually. I think the Indian ambassador said he voted for it and told them, I hope I don't have to say to you, I told you so. But if you shoot all your bullets, like, what do you have left?
Yeah. I mean, I guess it does make a little sense, this other argument you brought up, that say you're a general, you're in the military, and you think, ultimately Gaddafi's going to lose here. The ICC thing does give you a little bit of an incentive to get off the boat ASAP, I guess. Huh?
Yeah, I guess, yeah. No, I mean, I think that's the other thing is, I mean, let's get into the ICC. They actually haven't, they've been in existence for almost a decade. They haven't actually convicted anybody yet. The president of Sudan, walks around freely despite being indicted by the ICC. And here's the worst one, Bob. This is the kind of thing that I like to cover over here. Is one of the initial Darfur indictees, a guy called Ahmed Haroun. He was charged with stirring up tribes in Darfur to commit genocide, burn down villages, drive people into IDP camps. Recently, the UN flew Ahmed Haroun on a UN aircraft to go and have a meeting with other nomadic tribes. They said that it was imperative because he was the only one that could talk to them. The reality is that so you have the UN that's supposed to represent not all that's good in the world, but certainly represent no impunity, flying an indicted war criminal around in their plane. And they really, I mean, I asked a question about it even today, and they tried to say, well, they're allowed to have necessary contacts. But my idea is that, Sudan has its own air force. It's almost like Sudan used the UN basically to try to kind of rehabilitate this guy or to mock the UN. They had him fly him in a UN vehicle. It would be like, I don't know, some mass murderer being driven around by the New York Police Department and let off to go into a restaurant. It just doesn't make any sense.
Of course, policing domestic policing also involves doing deals with thugs and stuff. I mean, there is a realist element to law enforcement everywhere, probably. But sure. I take your point.
No, I can see them arresting him. Yeah, I can see them arresting
these things out and expose them. So on Libya, before we move on to anything else, anything. Just quickly, so what has gone through the Security Council, and is there any chance, anything else of significance that's likely to come through at any time soon on Libya?
Yeah, the real world thing would be if somebody wanted there's a couple of things. I mean, I was there this morning on, actually, although there wasn't a council meeting, there was meetings by China with each of the members to plan this month. China's the president for March, so everyone that came out, I'd ask them what's going on. The focus, the sort of feel-good kumbaya focus was, now we just have to implement Saturday's resolution. And the resolution is really about sanctions and freezing Gaddafi's money. It's unclear to me if it's actually going to stop the violence on the ground. There was some talk that even beyond a sort of Western, I hate to say it, Western thought up, although it might be Arab requested as well, no-fly zone, that some countries might actually want to go in to get their own nationals. There was some talk of Egypt, for example, or Libya. So, I mean, I guess there could be an emergency request by some countries saying, it's too much. We need to get in there. They're going to end up saying, it was a sort of it felt good. They didn't commit any resources. They referred the case. They felt that they'd accomplished something. Whether it's actually changed events on the ground yet is unclear, There's going to be the vote this afternoon to throw them off I think what I would guess is unless Gaddafi somehow turns tail, as this continues, there's going to be a weird sense of Jesus, we shot all our, I think the Indian ambassador is going to say, I told you so, and then they're going to have to really think what to do next.
Yeah. I think the goal should be to keep it from becoming a protracted civil war and get him out of there quick. And I would think getting rid of his air force is one way or another would get you moving toward that goal. So another big story that's come that you covered, at least within the last month, is the famous and in some circles infamous United States veto of the resolution we discussed that deemed the Israeli settlements illegal. Now, the U.S. tried pretty hard, I guess, to get a compromise resolution passed, right? That wasn't nothing, because it deemed these settlements illegitimate rather than illegal, right?
And it also wasn't a resolution. That was the big thing. They were trying.
I see. So that was not a Security Council
resolution.
resolution.
Yeah, it wasn't. The one that they vetoed was a resolution. Their sort of last-minute negotiating strategy was to offer what's called a presidential statement, which is it is adopted by all 15 members, but it's not binding on anyone. And was to offer, and then they sort of wanted to promise in advance that the meeting of the quartet, right, which is like the U.S., EU, Russia, and the UN. That they would issue another statement on settlements. And here was the kind of irony, is that Susan Rice offered to the Arab group that came to visit with her that the U.S. would then not oppose and would even praise this idea of a Security Council trip to the Middle East by all 15 countries to Jerusalem and maybe to Gaza. I think the behind the scenes here is that a lot of, especially the European countries, they feel really marginalized. I mean, somehow it's the issue of the Palestinians and Israel is a big deal in their countries, but they really have no power over it. It's basically the U.S. is the kingmaker and the deal maker,
right?
And so they almost sort of took some pleasure. I won't say that they wanted the U.S. to be marginalized, but deep down that's why they all said they would support this resolution on the illegality of settlements. And and people were wondering, this was I know that the Obama administration got a lot of pressure to actually cast the veto. The part that I found hypocritical on the U.S.'s part was the day before the vote, they were making this offer to go on the trip and praise this idea of a council trip to the Middle East. The moment that they had to cast the veto, they said, well, that offer's off the table and the trip's a terrible idea. And I asked Susan Rice, they had a phone call for the press afterwards, like, what changed? How could you on one day be saying, and unless you admit that, like, life is a card game, and, like, we would have said it was helpful if you'd taken the other deal, but now that it's off the table, basically it was almost kind of like retaliation, like, now we're against it. We're not going to allow these other countries to pretend.
Yeah, but don't you think they let before the vote, she did convey to the other countries that was the deal? That if they would not pass the resolution, we would embrace the visit to the Middle East?
I think I agree with you, and I guess as an individual, like if you were bidding on a house, you're allowed to say, if you drop the price, I won't look at the dirty basement or something, But for some reason, maybe I'm naive. It seemed real. They had no good answer of why the trip would have been a good idea on Thursday, but on Friday was a terrible idea. You know what I mean? Except to say, like, well, we offered them a package deal and they didn't take it. And, the problem is it's not like they can take the deal to somebody else. So I think that this was a kind of the thing that's, the Palestinian mission here at the UN, they're called an observer mission. In a way, they may have made a mistake, too. I think that they must have thought that when push came to shove, the Obama administration wouldn't veto it, Sort of like their big threat.
I would call that politically naive.
Yeah. Oh, do you think my statement, or do you think them thinking that?
No, them thinking that.
Yeah, I think that they miscalculated.
You think they really did think that? I mean, it's not totally crazy because Obama had so publicly tried to get Netanyahu to quit building settlements that it was kind of humiliating for him to then turn around and veto this resolution, which seemed quite in line with his own position. So I can see them holding out some hope. At the same time, if you know American domestic politics, I wouldn't hold out a lot of hope.
Exactly. I think that they miscalculated. They sort of thought that Obama was, they put it to the test, but now they're kind of screwed because they're only, and it's really an illusory threat. Now it's actually structurally it's not that different than the Libya thing. They shot all their bullets. Now they have nothing. Their goal is now to go to the General Assembly and get a resolution that will only be opposed by the U.S. and some really servile client states like Nauru and the Marshall Islands and Palau to denounce and they've called it. They're going to override the Security Council decision. The only problem is that the GA the General Assembly can't override it. Right. All the GA is issues, kind of proclamations. So I think that they may have kind of shot their load, but maybe they felt put in a corner that they made this threat to call the vote. The U.S. said go ahead, and so then they were left. In any case, it wasn't. I wouldn't call that a very bright day for diplomacy at the UN.
No, and I don't suppose anybody said to the United States, well, suppose you took this wording about the settlements being illegitimate and made it an actual Security Council resolution. Did anybody?
Yeah, I think I have to hope that behind the scenes that was floated, but it seems like they kept asking for more and more time, and it was just the whole thing was really. The part that actually, and as you might imagine, rather than go for these kind of big picture. It's not even a question of big picture. Everyone has like a kind of a black or white opinion of that resolution. But what I did find, and this is why I like reporting from here, is the day before the resolution was passed, there was something like 120 sponsors. You know, they were all listed at the top of the resolution. And then I heard from my sources in the council that a few countries started emailing in and saying, please take me off the sponsor list. These included, you know, Kazakhstan, Panama, Trinidad and Tobago. And it's clear to me that there were U.S. pressure brought to bear on these relatively, you know, nowhere near the Middle East countries to drop off.
Now, see, that's what I don't get. In other words, okay, granted that domestic politics seem to require, at least in the judgment of Obama, he may be wrong, but in the judgment of all presidents, domestic politics require that we publicly, the United States publicly veto this thing. Why? You know, why do we have to go spend all this time pulling levers behind the scenes to decrease by 0.03%
exactly
the perceived international support for this
I have absolutely no idea, and I guess it's because, you know, they think that even if there's a difference of 5 votes, it's going to look like it's less. You know, it's less of a clear-cut majority.
It'll look less like we caved to domestic political pressure. That's the answer.
Right.
We won't look like such an outlier.
Yeah, we're just like Kazakhstan. You know, no, I totally.
Right,
and
right.
I think it's a really dirty pool too, because it's sort of. I mean, one of the things that I try to cover here is you have these public pronouncements by the U.S. that, you know, they like the UN and they're playing ball. But when you start strong-arming people for their vote, basically in exchange for money, that's not pretty politics. And the other thing is, I don't know. We didn't plan. I just want to say this that. And this is having now covered the UN under the waning days of the Bush administration and now the Obama administration. The only thing that sort of kept the UN on the maybe overplayed, but I don't think so, sort of corruption front, you know, kind of like waste of money or flying war criminals around, just total impunity, was a kind of a critical U.S. approach. And the only sort of new thing, I don't really think the Obama administration has brought a new approach, certainly on asking for exemptions from ICC referrals or vetoing the settlements resolution. But what they have brought a new approach to is to not being critical of any amount of waste, sleaze, or fraud by the UN, because they want to get along. And so, for example, the Republicans, and you can like it or not, but in the House Foreign Affairs Committee and on the Budget Committee, it turns out that the UN owed the U.S. something like $179 million. It's called the Tax Equalization Fund. It's money owed back from taxes collected from U.S. staff. It's a bit complicated, but there's no dispute that they owed it back to the U.S. Treasury. And the Obama administration basically said, without going public in any way, you can keep $100 million of it. So I've been digging into this and just asking. I'm not neither for or against the U.S. giving more money to the UN, but the UN should be able to account for it. And basically, so where in the budget is this line? What they've said is this is for security. They're afraid that a car bomber could be on the FDR drive, but it's all so murky. It just showed me you can't run a public organization on the back of an envelope. You know. Anyway, I mean that may be.
I've tried to run a private one on the back of an envelope.
Yeah, sure. I know. I'm a big envelope guy myself, but I'm also not getting $100 million.
That's interesting. So you're saying that kind of the Obama administration, because kind of. It pains the administration almost to do these things like veto this resolution, and it really wants to get along with the UN, that it's kind of slipping them some money, basically.
Absolutely. It slipped them money, and also it's not critical. Like you'd think, I mean, maybe because of the U.S. position on the ICC, they couldn't say it, but the UN flying around a war criminal, that's pretty bad, you know?
Yeah.
And even things like, you know, there was a case in the last summer where you know there was sort of mass rape in the Congo, which sadly is not all that infrequent. But this took place literally right outside a UN peacekeepers base, and it's the kind of thing that, you know, for better or worse, someone like a John Bolton would have said, isn't this the outrage? You know, isn't this the epitome of you know, we pay $1 billion for a peacekeeping mission and they can't even protect people right outside the gate. Now that may be unfair, but I will say this: being here enough. There's no accountability. I mean, my point is, for example, the peacekeeping mission in the Congo, they'll say, you know, every time something bad happens, they say, well, it's a country as big as Western Europe with no roads. What can we do? But my thing would be, do something. Choose a small area, maybe. Maybe you can't solve the whole problem, but choose one area, you know, flood it with peacekeepers and say, here we can protect civilians. And then, people give you more money.
Yeah. Now, and I would like to pause and do a little advertisement for Matthew Lee here. Your critical reporting of the United Nations transcends ideological bias. It really does. I mean, you're you know, and that's why sometimes your critiques, your reporting aligns with the right-wing critique of the UN, and sometimes it seems to, you know, align with the left. because you're just being an all-purpose watchdog, which is what a good reporter should be.
Thanks. But it's true. There's a lot of. I think I'm usually actually thought of here as being right-wing because that's the thing I don't like about it. Even if you like the UN, and I don't dislike it, I wouldn't be here. But like, even if you like it, this amount of lack of accountability, and there's sort of no, So today I asked a question about an audit report that came out showing massive corruption in their computer system. PricewaterhouseCoopers got a contract without, where they weren't the low bidder. Friends were hired, and you say, okay, this document's now been leaked. What's going to happen? No one's been fired. There's been no, even a public company, they do something. They try to put it. So I think that it doesn't. The UN's defenders to allow it to be this. Unaccountable is not.
No, I agree. I mean, there are a lot of. I am a big global governance guy and defender of the UN in principle as an institution that needs to be nourished. And a lot of people who share my ideology, or at least some people, kind of resist your reporting, and including. I mean, in a personal way. They're you.
Yeah.
They don't.
Oh no, I got
you.
some.
And I got to say, I think that's misguided because. If you want the UN to become a really substantial, important body, part of that process is that it becomes open to public inspection, and people argue about it and try to make it run as well as possible.
I think especially and I'd even put it even more. I mean, I was doing this when I first got here under Bush, so I can't. I obviously don't make this distinction, but I think especially in a time where in the U.S. the administration is so much trying to say the UN is good. Look, we're working with the UN. You really have to be critical. I mean, I think when I first got here, people were saying, okay, it's true what you're saying, but you're just helping the UN's enemies to attack it. But right now, the U.S. administration loves the UN. I mean, Susan Rice went out to the West Coast, and basically, I've seen the conservative critique of her trip. She went to Facebook and Twitter. They said well, isn't Susan Rice supposed to be representing the U.S. interest at the UN? Now she's representing the UN interest in the U.S. But I think especially in this, and I will say it's really, they should have done a better job. The Obama administration, the current State Department, they've had a position in charge of UN management that's supposed to be looking at these issues. They've left it vacant for more than a year now. They've shown so little interest in sort of even just following up sort of basic things like where did the money go. That it's things have actually become less accountable at the UN in the last 2 years than they were before.
Mm-hmm.
So but also you have to. What I would say is, so where's the UK and France? And this goes back to the initial thing of the permanent five. I think the UK and France, they like the UN Security Council getting involved in things because it makes them more powerful. In the real world, their power has declined radically, as opposed to, say, China and the U.S.
Right,
and so they're big believers in internationalism only because it inflates their power because they have seats on the council.
Yeah, well, but I think this is the reason we should be in favor of building a robust system of international laws, because we are relatively speaking, a declining power, inevitably, as China grows, and we should prepare for the day when it isn't just the strong who get their way.
The interesting thing is a country like India, which is actually a real world rising power, they desperately want to get onto the Security Council with a permanent seat. I've gone to briefing after briefing by this guy, Hardeep Singh Puri, and he's predicting it's going to happen in 2012. They were so happy with Obama's trip to India where he said, we're going to support you. And it is a little strange. I think ultimately maybe this is there's this whole conflict of is the number of permanent members going to expand? Mm-hmm. And I think that it's not, because these five each have a veto. There can be no change with one veto of the five.
Right.
It's a kind of an unreformable system. The only way it might change is if the Indias and Brazils of the world, maybe Indonesia, Turkey, if they said, what, we're going to quit the UN. Unless you change it in such a way as to bring it past the 1945 structure, we're going to quit it and start our own group. Maybe that's not realistic, and maybe people would see that as too far out. But again, it's one of these things where, let's say, France and the UK, this system is benefiting them a lot.
Right. So why should they allow?
Yeah, they don't want to. If you give even one additional seat, or certainly one additional veto, you're just watering down your power.
Right. And in general, I think the last thing we need is to increase the number of nations who can unilaterally veto stuff. You could, in principle, expand the Security Council and change it from the requirement from a unanimous vote to a supermajority so that it takes two to veto. But that, I gather, that is so much more visionary than anything that would ever really get discussed in a serious way at the United Nations, right?
But you see, exactly. I think that maybe even the cleaner reform, just as an interim thing, would be to say, you can, to veto, you have to have 2 of the permanent members. You know,
that's what I'm saying.
But think about it. What do you think? I mean, on the issue we're talking about, the Israel settlements. Who do you think would support that? Nobody would support that.
The U.S. would never let this happen.
Exactly. So in fact, the ultimate.
Even though, when you think about it, right? First of all, it would have to be a pretty I mean, even it would have to be a pretty overwhelming opposition to what we wanted if we couldn't even get Britain to go along with us to veto something,
exactly.
Right?
But
the other thing is, you would think presidents might kind of like to have some political cover so that they could say, well, we tried to veto the settlements resolution, but it takes 2 and we couldn't get it done.
I think you're right, but I think that there would be a big push as soon as this thing was proposed here and it became reported that the U.S. was going to support it. There would be an enormous pressure on the U.S.
The reform itself would be a brouhaha. We wouldn't get it passed. Well, we should. Is there anything we've gone on a while? We should probably call it to a close. Any other big issue you wanted to quickly?
I guess I'll have to say this because it's something that I've been following in a very heart-heavy way for about the last year. We're coming to the sort of the very sad whimpering end of the UN's inquiry into war crimes in Sri Lanka. I kind of got interested in this when I went May 2009.
Yeah.
I went there with the Security Council. The Secretary General visited, and again, without the Tamil Tigers were a terrible group, but there were 40,000. I believe that's the numbers in the tens of thousands civilians killed in like the spring of 2009. The UN said it would investigate it. Sri Lanka is a real stickler on sovereignty. It turns out there's some kind of murky history between Ban Ki-moon and Sri Lanka because they had a candidate for Secretary General that dropped out. Anyway, it's been just a comedy of errors in which they haven't been able to even go to the country and do the investigation. They're not actually investigating what happened, but only reporting on the Sri Lanka's own accountability mechanism, and even that they cannot get done, and they can't sort of tell a straight story. They claim that there wasn't a meeting, that I went and went as a photographer, as a photo op, and there was the meeting, and there was Ban Ki-moon shaking hands with this guy called Shavendra Silva, who was widely described as the general who killed all those people, and he was inside the UN, in the 3rd floor of the North Lawn, shaking hands with the Secretary General, whose own chief of staff is accused of luring, surrendering Tamil Tiger leaders to their ultimate demise, shot by the government. I actually think in covering the UN, it's the worst thing that I've seen because it's not just inaction and ineffectuality. It's sort of like, at least on paper, it looks like the chief of staff of the Secretary General was, conspired or was used to lure people surrendering with white flags to their death. So this is an issue that I keep thinking like sort of the story's going to be over and I'll sort of write not my final piece, but on that. And it just goes on and gets worse. So that's my rant for the day.
Okay, I'll have to leave it at that because I don't know the details. I mean, I assume it's the case that if you're Secretary General of the UN, you often find yourself in situations where it's hard not to shake the hands of people. But
sure.
Beyond that,
no. But if you go to like the African Union meeting in Addis Ababa and there's Mugabe, that's understood. But this is one where they set it up. I mean, it was really And let's go back to the thing in Sudan. They didn't have to put that guy in a helicopter. I think that there's something, and that's sort of the problem of a lack of accountability. Even in the U.S. government, if you're a Defense Department or a State Department figure that makes one of these controversial decisions, when you screw up, you're going to get called in front of Congress. Maybe you have to quit. Here, nothing happens. There's no mechanism to call you anywhere.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean? So there really should be kind of some kind of a panel, but that's for another day.
I will take your word for that, and I'm willing to serve on it when you get it set.
All right. And I think technology could be.
I plan to serve from here. I'm definitely not going into New York. No, I insist I will only serve from here virtually. So Matthew, thank you. You're doing a great job.
Thanks a lot. No, I'm telling you, I'm a huge fan of Blogging Heads. I've been off for too long, but hopefully we'll see what happens. But I like it.
We're here for you.
Yeah.
Consider your platform.
Okay.
All right.
See you.
Take care.